Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: Trump flexes dominance with counter-programming to Republican debate. Democrats see 2024 roadmap in election wins as Biden problems loom. U.S. strikes Iranian facility in Syria amid attacks on American troops. Another election, another sign the GOP could win with normie candidates. Why youth turnout is a subplot to every election cycle. Trump flexes dominance with counter-programming to Republican debate. Washington Post. Donald Trump is escalating his campaign to make a mockery of the primary process Wednesday night by bringing a rally to the doorstep of the third Republican debate, raising pressure on his rivals and the party to wrap up the contest. Democrats see 2024 roadmap in election wins as Biden problems loom. Washington Post. Democrats are touting Tuesday's victories in red-leaning Kentucky and Ohio and battleground Virginia as a blueprint for 2024, even as they grapple with President Joe Biden's low approval ratings and seek to distance themselves from him. Republicans, meanwhile, are soul-searching after a series of election losses since 2017, most recently in Ohio, where voters supported a constitutional amendment guaranteeing access to abortion, and Virginia, where Democrats took control of the state legislature. The results have prompted Republicans to rethink their messaging on abortion and other issues, as well as their strategy of aligning themselves with former President Donald Trump, who is seeking to lead the party into the next election despite facing criminal indictments. Biden's age and low approval ratings remain a concern for Democrats, but they are confident that voters will re-evaluate their options once the president becomes the Democratic nominee and the only alternative to Trump. The party's strategy is to replicate the contrast between its own candidates and Republicans that was established on Tuesday, when voters rejected what Republicans were selling. U.S. strikes Iranian facility in Syria amid attacks on American troops. Washington Post. The U.S. military carried out an airstrike in eastern Syria on Wednesday, targeting a weapons storage facility used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. The strike was authorized by President Biden and was aimed at protecting American troops and preventing the conflict between Israel and Hamas from escalating. The strike comes after a U.S. surveillance drone was shot down off the coast of Yemen, where Houthi forces have received weapons from Iran. The Pentagon has characterized the attacks on American personnel as harassing in nature, but concerns have been raised about the possibility of an American service member being killed. The U.S. has previously carried out airstrikes in Syria in response to attacks on American positions. Another election, another sign the GOP could win with normie candidates. Washington Post. Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams has won more votes than any other candidate in the state following the 2021 election after distancing himself from election denialism. Adams, a Republican, publicly repudiated the idea that the 2020 election was stolen, and went on to win his re-election campaign by a wide margin. The race is part of a pattern, which emerged in the 2022 election, showing that candidates who distance themselves from Donald Trump and election denialism often perform well. Why youth turnout is a subplot to every election cycle. Washington Post. Current and former leaders of four groups focused on organizing young people have written a letter warning that President Biden risks losing support from younger voters if he doesn't revise his position on the Israel-Hamas war. The letter warns that it may not be possible to recruit the volunteers, organizers, staff, and donors needed to deliver Democratic victories in future elections if Biden maintains his policy on the conflict. The threat is meant to strike at one of Biden's fears, that young and non-white voters are becoming apathetic and will not turn out to vote. While youth voter turnout has increased in recent years, older Americans still consistently vote more. Voting is easier for those with regular hours, for retirees, and for those who don't move often, which tend to be older people. Young people are more likely to be Democrats, and their lower turnout is more likely to hurt the Democratic Party. However, the letter's threat is unlikely to have much effect on youth turnout, which is influenced by broader trends rather than individual organizations. Blinken lays out possible endgame in Gaza under Palestinian Authority. New York Times. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that Gaza should be unified with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, offering a strong signal about what the United States sees as its preferred endgame in the fight between Israel and Hamas. Blinken's comments came as President Biden feels growing pressure to use his leverage to push for sustainable, long-term goals in the region and minimize civilian casualties. In the immediate hours and days after Hamas invaded Israel on October 7 and killed more than 1,400 people, Biden fully embraced Israel's right to respond, a position that White House officials still repeat frequently. However, as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza deepens, Biden has tried to balance his support for Israel with calls for the protection of Palestinian non-combatants and for humanitarian pauses in the fighting. Another potential split emerged this week, when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel suggested that his country could hold a security role in Gaza for an indefinite period after the war is over. U.S. warplanes carry out a self-defense strike in Syria. Bloomberg. U.S. warplanes have carried out airstrikes on a weapons storage facility in eastern Syria that was allegedly linked to Iran and its affiliated groups. The strikes were launched in response to a series of attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by Iranian-backed forces. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that the U.S. will defend itself, its personnel, and its interests. The strikes come after the Pentagon reported that there had been at least 41 attacks on American military personnel in Iraq and Syria since October 17. The White House condemns Rashida Tlaib's embrace of the river to the sea slogan. New York Times. The White House has condemned Representative Rashida Tlaib for using the phrase, "from the river to the sea," which is seen as a rallying cry for the eradication of Israel. Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress, has defended her use of the phrase as an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence. The House censured Tlaib for her statements regarding the Israel-Hamas war, with a resolution accusing her of promoting false narratives. The resolution passed with 22 Democrats voting in favor. The White House called the phrase divisive and anti-Semitic. First FT, Antony Blinken calls for Palestinian Authority to run Gaza and West Bank after Israel-Hamas war. Financial Times. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has outlined the U.S.'s most detailed plan for the future of Gaza, calling for the enclave to be politically unified with the West Bank under the administration of the Palestinian Authority (PA). Blinken said that the PA should replace Hamas in Gaza, but added that Israel could play a role in a transition period. However, Arab officials have warned that it is unrealistic to expect the PA to easily take over from Hamas if Israel succeeds in defeating the group. Biden administration picks Maryland for new FBI headquarters, AP sources say. Associated Press. The Biden administration has chosen a location for a new FBI headquarters in Greenbelt, Maryland, over nearby Virginia. The decision comes after a long competition between the two states. Maryland Governor Wes Moore argued that building the headquarters in Greenbelt would be faster and save taxpayers $1 billion. He also stated that locating it in Prince George's County would meet equity goals raised by President Joe Biden. Virginia, on the other hand, already has the FBI Academy in Quantico, and argued that the federal government should follow in the steps of big companies that have established a presence in the state. The FBI has been discussing plans to replace its current J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington for over 15 years. More than 1,000 USAID employees sign letter backing Gaza ceasefire. Al Jazeera. Over 1,000 staffers at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, have signed a letter calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The letter, which started circulating last week, represents officials from across USAID's departments and overseas missions and criticizes the numerous violations of international law and the rising civilian death toll in Gaza. The employees call for an immediate ceasefire, the release of Israeli hostages, and the restoration of essential services to Gaza. They also call on the U.S. government to hold all parties to international law, including ending Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territories and settlements on occupied land. The letter comes as a growing number of government employees voice their dissent against U.S. support for Israel's military offensive in Gaza. In addition to the USAID staffers, hundreds of congressional staffers have also called for a ceasefire, and a senior official at the Department of State resigned in protest against U.S. policy towards Israel. A package of bold laws puts Michigan on a fast track to renewable energy. New York Times. The Michigan Senate has given final approval to a package of clean energy bills that would require the state to generate all of its electricity from carbon-free sources by 2040. The legislation also tightens energy efficiency requirements for electric utilities, streamlines permits for new wind and solar power, and allows more residents to enroll in a rooftop solar energy program. Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who is expected to sign the legislation into law later this month, hailed the move as making Michigan a national leader on clean energy. The state has previously been regarded as a laggard in terms of environmental policy. However, support has grown as the state has experienced the economic costs of climate change, including increased flooding, the spread of toxic algae in the Great Lakes, and the decline of its fruit crops. The legislation has garnered criticism from Republicans and major business groups, including the Michigan Manufacturers Association, which represents over 1,000 companies including Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. They fear the rapid transition will lead to higher energy costs and threaten the reliability of electricity supply. Behind the scenes, the Trudeau government's balancing act is getting even tougher as the Israel-Hamas crisis deepens. The Toronto Star. The Canadian government has been struggling to respond to the Israeli-Hamas conflict, according to sources who spoke to the Star. The Trudeau administration initially expressed unequivocal support for Israel's right to defend itself, but has since shifted its tone to express concern for the protection of Palestinian civilians. The Trudeau government has faced mounting pressure to disavow Israel's military response to the initial attack by Hamas militants, but has so far remained supportive of Israel. Trudeau has called for a pause in the fighting to allow for the delivery of humanitarian assistance and to de-escalate violence. The government has faced criticism for its response to the crisis, with some critics arguing that Canada's lack of influence has prevented it from being invited to join statements of support for Israel from its G7 partners. However, Canadian officials have rejected these claims, saying that Canada's unequivocal support for Israel is in line with its position under the previous Harper government. The government has faced pressure from both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian crowds, with demonstrations taking place in support of both sides. The government has also had to balance freedom of expression with the diversity of views being expressed in schools, universities, and workplaces. Canada has taken steps to evacuate Canadians from the region, with military flights out of Israel and bus charters for those fleeing the West Bank. The Canadian government has also provided increased humanitarian aid to Gaza, but has not supplied military aid to Israel. The government has come closer than the U.S. to publicly criticizing Israel, but has not gone as far as demanding a ceasefire. Trudeau has defended Israel's right to defend itself, but has also expressed concern for the suffering of Palestinian civilians. Canadian diplomats are now considering ways to open up space for discussions about a two-state solution. Trump looks to upstage the GOP debate with a rally targeting South Florida's Cuban community. The Toronto Star. Former President Donald Trump held a rally in Hialeah, Florida, on Wednesday to showcase his support among Latino voters. The rally was an attempt to upstage the third debate between his rivals for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. Trump has cited his commanding lead in the polls as the reason he has not participated directly in the debates, but he has looked for ways to draw attention to himself with distinctive, simultaneous events. The rally in Hialeah aimed to demonstrate Trump's strength heading into the 2024 election, and to hammer the message that the 5 candidates debating in Miami are irrelevant. Trump's campaign is planning ads on Hispanic TV and radio, along with targeted mail. His advisors believe his messages about the economy, the U.S.-Mexico border, and cultural issues will resonate with Latino voters. Trump has long courted the Cuban community, which skews more Republican than other Hispanics. According to Pew, a majority of Cuban American voters, 58%, identified as Republican or Republican-leaning before the 2020 election. White House, 96% of Ukraine aid already spent. Yahoo! The U.S. has already spent 96% of the funds allocated for Ukraine since the beginning of the war, according to White House spokesperson John Kirby. The funds, which amount to more than $60 billion, have been used for security assistance, as well as economic, financial, and humanitarian assistance. Despite challenges, the Biden administration remains confident in Ukraine's ability to achieve its goals. Funding to Ukraine has become a political controversy in the U.S., with the Biden administration supporting continued support while partisan battles over aid take place in the legislature. Why are U.S. Republicans pushing for aid to Israel but not Ukraine? Al Jazeera. There is a growing battle in the U.S. Congress over which country should receive aid money, as Republicans express increasing skepticism towards providing more funds for Ukraine, while some Republicans position aid for Israel and Ukraine as an either-or proposition. This signals the growing power of the party's hard-right flank. The debate over foreign aid comes amid turmoil within the Republican caucus, and former President Donald Trump's continued sway over the party is evident. Trump has remained critical of aid to Ukraine, and his resentment towards Ukraine is likely due to the questions over whether he illegally withheld military aid to Ukraine that led to his first impeachment, as well as his cozy relationship with Russia's Vladimir Putin. Trump's America First foreign policy, which saw the U.S. withdraw from certain international agreements, is still popular among some Republicans. However, there are still prominent supporters of aid to Ukraine in the Republican Party, such as Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Thursday briefing: What's next in the Israel-Hamas war? New York Times. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has said that Gaza should be unified with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. Israel's plans for the region, however, remain unclear. This analysis suggests that the next few weeks could see the bloodiest fighting of the war so far, as Israeli forces enter Hamas's stronghold, Gaza City. Once the Israeli army takes over the hospitals there, the fighting could become even more intense. Israel's broader strategy for Gaza remains vague, and there are calls for the area to be reoccupied permanently or for the Palestinian Authority to take over. The mood in Israel is one of anger, mourning, and a lack of trust in the government. Among Palestinians, there is fear of displacement and a sense of abandonment by the West and the U.S. As giant pandas exit Washington, will U.S.-China diplomacy retreat too? South China Morning Post. 3 giant pandas have left the Smithsonian's National Zoo in Washington, D.C., for China, marking the end of a 23-year loan agreement between the two countries. The pandas Mei Xiang, Tian Tian, and their cub, Xiao Qi Ji, will fly to Chengdu in Sichuan Province, with a refueling stop in Anchorage, Alaska. The departure of the pandas comes ahead of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to San Francisco for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Summit from November 14 to 17, where he will meet with U.S. President Joe Biden. The loan agreement for the pandas expired on December 7, and attempts to extend the arrangement failed amid an increasingly hostile U.S.-China relationship. The pandas' return to China is seen as a sign of the strained ties between the two countries. The San Diego Zoo returned its pandas in 2019, and the Memphis Zoo returned one earlier this year. Zoo Atlanta is now the only place in the U.S. where giant pandas can be seen, but the lease for those four pandas expires next year. House committee subpoenas Biden's son and brother. BBC. Congressional Republicans have issued legal summons to several members of the Biden family as part of their impeachment inquiry into President Biden. The House Oversight Committee has subpoenaed Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, as well as Biden's brother James and family associate Rob Walker. The committee is also requesting transcribed interviews with 5 others. The White House accused Republicans of conducting a smear campaign and abusing their power. The House Republicans opened their impeachment inquiry in September, claiming to have evidence of President Biden's involvement in his family's business dealings. However, further evidence is needed to determine if any impeachable offenses were committed. The House Oversight Committee claims to have obtained financial records showing that the Biden family set up shell companies to hide overseas payments during Joe Biden's vice presidency. The committee alleges that the family and its associates received over $24 million from foreign nations, including U.S. adversaries. The committee plans to question members of the Biden family and their associates on this evidence. The White House dismissed the investigation as a partisan inquiry, with no evidence of wrongdoing by the president. The subpoenas and interview requests come after the special counsel overseeing the federal probe into Hunter Biden testified to lawmakers, refuting claims that the White House is interfering with the investigation. Hunter Biden is currently facing federal gun charges, to which he has pleaded not guilty. Republican 2024 candidates set for Miami showdown, minus Trump. Financial Times. 5 Republican candidates are set to participate in a debate in Miami, Florida, while former President Donald Trump holds a campaign rally in the same city. The debate follows Democratic victories in off-year elections, which were driven in part by voter rejection of Republican proposals to restrict abortion access. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie blamed Trump for the Republican Party's poor performance and said that the losing will only end for Republicans if we rid ourselves of Donald Trump. The debate will likely touch on foreign policy, and will be the third time that Trump has skipped the event. Well folks, that's all the news we have for today. It's been quite a whirlwind of headlines, from Trump's counter-programming to the Republican debate, to the Democrats touting their recent victories as a blueprint for the future. And let's not forget the escalating conflict in the Middle East and the growing debate over foreign aid. Now, let's dive into some analysis. First off, Trump's rally in Florida was a classic move to steal the spotlight. Love him or hate him, the man knows how to command attention. And speaking of attention, the Democrats are feeling pretty good after their recent wins. They're hoping to replicate the contrast between their candidates and the Republicans, and they're confident that once Biden becomes the Democratic nominee, voters will have no choice but to choose him over Trump. Moving on to the Middle East, tensions are high with the U.S. carrying out airstrikes in Syria, and the conflict between Israel and Hamas escalating. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has suggested that Gaza should be unified with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, but the future of the region remains uncertain. As for foreign aid, there's a battle brewing in Congress over who should receive funding. Republicans are increasingly skeptical of providing more aid to Ukraine, while some are pushing for continued support to Israel. It's a delicate balancing act for the Biden administration. And finally, it seems like everyone is talking about the Canadian government's response to the Israel-Hamas crisis. Trudeau's administration has faced criticism for its initial support of Israel and pressure to disavow its military response. The government has taken steps to evacuate Canadians from the region and provide humanitarian aid, but finding the right balance between supporting Israel and advocating for Palestinian rights is proving to be a challenge. So, there you have it, folks. A lot happening in the world today. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you agree with the Democrats' strategy for 2024? What do you think should be the future of Gaza? And how do you feel about the Biden administration's handling of foreign aid? Let's get the discussion going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.